There's a dog in my back seat and he's not mine. Jason Roberts stared into the rearview mirror, blinking twice to make sure he wasn't hallucinating. The little golden fluff ball didn't flinch. Instead, it wagged its tail happily, nestled against the cloth seat of his 2006 Honda Civic like it belonged there. Jason had just stepped out of the Dollar General in the small town of Boonville, Indiana, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, or at least their cousins. He'd only gone in for a pack of gum and a jug of windshield washer fluid. But now, as he opened the door and prepared to throw his plastic bag onto the passenger seat, he caught a glimpse of movement in the back. His heart jumped, first with surprise, then confusion, and finally a strange mix of curiosity and concern. He turned fully in his seat to face the little intruder. The pup was tiny, probably no more than 8 or 9 weeks old, with ears too big for its head and wide, trusting brown eyes. It didn't have a collar, just a scraggly patch of fur on its left side that looked like it had been rubbed raw. Jason glanced around the parking lot, expecting to see someone running toward him, shouting about a missing puppy. But the lot was nearly empty, save for a woman walking slowly toward her pickup and an older man loading mulch into his trunk. "Hey, buddy," Jason said softly, leaning closer. The puppy's ears perked. "Where'd you come from?" He opened the back door slowly, crouched, and extended his hand. The puppy sniffed it, and then, to his surprise, crawled into his lap, tail thumping. Jason looked around again, half expecting someone to yell at him for stealing their dog. But there was nothing. No shouting, no frantic searching, just a lazy mid-afternoon calm. Jason sat there for a long moment, trying to decide what to do. He wasn't a dog person. Not that he disliked them, but his life wasn't exactly set up for pets. He was a high school biology teacher in nearby Evansville, living alone in a modest apartment that barely had space for his stacks of science magazines, let alone a living, breathing animal. Still, there was something about the way the puppy had settled into his lap that tugged at him. He gently set the puppy back on the seat and stepped out of the car, checking under the chassis and nearby bushes in case there were more animals or any signs of how the puppy had gotten in. He even walked into the store to ask the cashier, a girl who looked no older than 16, if anyone had reported a missing dog. "Nope," she said, popping her gum. "But a lady did come in earlier and said something about hearing yapping in the lot. I figured she was just being weird. Sometimes people are weird, you know." Jason thanked her and returned to his car. The puppy was now curled into a tight little ball, snoring faintly. It was almost comical. "Well, I can't just leave you here," he muttered. He drove back to Evansville, with the puppy nestled in the back seat, occasionally peeking up to look around, then flopping back down as if it had always known it would end up here. Jason called the local animal shelter and left a message, then posted a picture of the pup on a community Facebook group. Once home, he carefully carried the puppy up to his second-floor apartment. The puppy wriggled a bit, but didn't seem frightened. Jason found an old shoebox and lined it with a towel, setting it beside the radiator. The puppy sniffed it, then climbed in like it had found its new throne. He named it Rusty. It wasn't original, but it fit. The puppy had that reddish golden coat and a scrappy charm. Jason poured some water into a bowl, sliced up a hot dog for food, and watched as Rusty devoured the meal like he hadn't eaten in days. The next morning, things took a strange turn. Jason was running late. He'd snoozed his alarm one too many times, and now he was half-dressed, rushing to pack his bag and grab breakfast. As he reached under the passenger seat to find a dropped pen, his fingers brushed something. It wasn't a pen. It was metallic and sharp-edged. He pulled it out slowly, A small, rusted tin box, no bigger than a deck of cards, was wedged deep beneath the seat. Jason blinked, then sat back on his heels. The box was dented at the corners and sealed with a piece of black electrical tape. It looked old, maybe decades old. He peeled off the tape carefully and opened it. Inside was a faded photograph of a little girl holding what looked like a very similar puppy, and beneath it, folded into quarters, a note in neat cursive handwriting. "To whoever finds this, please take care of him. His name is Rusty. He's a good boy. Love, Ellie." Jason stared at the photo. The girl couldn't have been older than 7 or 8, grinning from ear to ear, missing her front teeth, clutching the tiny puppy with all the joy in the world. He looked over at Rusty, who was now chewing a corner of his backpack. "Well, Rusty," Jason whispered, heart pounding, "looks like you have a story." He took the box to school with him that day, unable to stop thinking about it. During his free period, he scanned the photograph, enlarged it, and tried to pick out any clues. Landmarks, names, anything. On the back of the photo, written faintly in pencil, was a date: July 12th, 1998. That night, Jason sat on his couch, laptop balanced on his knees, Rusty curled up at his feet. He dove into a rabbit hole of newspaper archives, missing pet reports, and any mention of a girl named Ellie who might have had a dog named Rusty back in the late 90s. It wasn't much to go on, but Jason was the kind of person who liked solving puzzles. Over the next week, Rusty became part of his routine. Jason bought real dog food, a couple of toys, and even a leash, though walks were more like sniff-everything marathons than exercise. The puppy followed him everywhere, even to the bathroom, and whined whenever Jason left for work. But every day when he returned, there was that happy yipping and the thud of tiny paws skittering across hardwood. Then came the first real break. A woman named Trish commented on Jason's Facebook post. "That looks just like my sister's dog from years ago. Her name was Ellie. We had a Rusty, too." Jason's hands trembled slightly as he typed back, "Do you still live around here? Can I call you?" They talked the next evening. Trish lived in Henderson, just across the Ohio River. She sounded cautious, but curious. "My sister Ellie had a dog named Rusty back in '98. We lived in a house in Mount Vernon. Rusty disappeared one night during a storm. Ellie cried for days. She died a few years later. Car accident. She was only 14. Jason felt his throat tighten. "I found a tin box under my seat. There was a photo and a note, signed Ellie." Trish went silent. "Do you think I could come see it?" she asked finally. Jason agreed. 2 days later, he met her at a local park. Rusty bounded up to her without hesitation, tail wagging. Trish sat on the bench, photo in hand, and wiped her eyes. "That's her. That's my Ellie. And that's Rusty. Or his grandson, maybe. I don't know how, but this feels like her. Like she's saying hi." Jason didn't know what to say. It did feel like something more than coincidence. The note, the name, the timing, it all pointed to something bigger. Trish didn't ask for Rusty. Instead, she placed a hand on the puppy's head and smiled. "You're lucky to have found each other. He's meant to be with you." Jason nodded slowly. He wasn't sure what he believed yet, but as Rusty licked his fingers and then fell asleep in his lap, he knew this was just the beginning. There were still questions to answer. How had the puppy gotten into his car? Where had it come from? And what did the old box really mean? Jason was about to find out that Rusty's story wasn't finished yet. Not even close. Jason woke up to a strange noise. It wasn't the soft whimpering Rusty sometimes made when dreaming, or the gentle scratching he'd gotten used to hearing from the puppy's crate. This was sharper, a scraping, like claws on metal. He bolted upright in bed, the gray light of dawn just beginning to seep through the blinds. His apartment was quiet otherwise. The hum of the fridge, the occasional drip from the bathroom faucet, the far-off rattle of a train that passed through Evansville every morning like clockwork. But then he heard it again. Scrape. Scrape. He pushed back the covers, feet hitting the cold hardwood as he crossed the room. Rusty's crate door was open. That wasn't unusual anymore. Jason had started leaving it unlocked after the first week. Once he trusted Rusty wouldn't chew his shoes or knock over his houseplants. He found the puppy in the living room, head buried under the couch, tail wagging wildly. "Rusty, what are you doing?" Jason asked, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. Rusty backed out with something in his mouth, a small rectangular piece of metal covered in dust. Jason crouched down, gently pried it from the puppy's mouth, and examined it. It was a key. Old-fashioned, the kind you'd expect to find in a skeleton key set, long and ornate. Rusty barked once and then sat, tail sweeping the floor. Jason turned it over in his hand. No markings, no tag. He stared at it for a moment, then looked under the couch. There was nothing else there, just a forgotten tennis ball and a few dust bunnies. He stood, turning the key over again and again. "Where did you find this, huh?" Rusty barked again and ran to the front door, tail stiff now, stance alert. "You want to go outside?" The pup barked once more. Jason hesitated, then grabbed his coat and the leash. It was cold for a March morning, colder than it should have been. The sky was dull and overcast, and the air carried the scent of wet concrete. Jason zipped up and let Rusty lead the way. They walked down the steps of his apartment complex, Rusty tugging insistently toward the parking lot. All right, Jason muttered, following. "This better not be another tin box situation." Rusty made a beeline for the car, Jason's beat-up Honda Civic. He circled it, then paused by the rear wheel on the driver's side, pawing at the asphalt. Jason crouched down beside him. "Don't tell me you buried something," he said, half joking. But then he saw it. A slight indentation in the gravel, a loose flap of black plastic that didn't quite belong. Jason dug at it with his fingers, then pulled it free. It was a weathered folder, wrapped in a plastic shopping bag for protection. He stood, brushing off gravel dust, and opened the bag. Inside the folder were several sheets of paper, slightly yellowed, but legible. One was a property map, an overhead drawing of what looked like a small farmhouse and several outbuildings. Another was a letter. "Ellie, in case you ever come back, the key is yours. You'll know where to go. Love, Dad." Jason's heart skipped a beat. He stared at the papers, then at Rusty. "You're kidding me," he said, half laughing. "This just keeps getting weirder." He carried the folder upstairs, Rusty trailing behind him proudly. At his kitchen table, Jason laid everything out. The letter had no address, but the map did. A handwritten note in the margin read, "Off 68, near the old Sycamore Creek Trail." He knew that area. It was about 40 minutes outside of town, mostly farmland and old state roads. Jason sat back, overwhelmed. This wasn't just a coincidence anymore. Someone had hidden these things, someone who'd expected Ellie to find them one day. But Ellie never got the chance. Jason knew what he had to do. He had a long weekend coming up. Spring break started Friday. He could take a drive out there, just to see. He spent the next few days preparing. He borrowed a friend's GPS, printed directions in case the signal dropped, packed some snacks, and made sure Rusty had everything he needed. By Friday morning, they were ready. The drive was peaceful, the roads mostly empty. Rusty sat in the passenger seat this time, ears perked, nose pressed against the cracked window. Jason glanced over at him every so often, still amazed by how natural it felt having the pup there. As they neared the location from the map, Jason slowed. The old Sycamore Creek Trail was barely marked, just a dent in the overgrown grass beside a narrow dirt road. He turned in, the Civic bouncing over potholes and stones. After 10 minutes of creeping along, they reached it. A faded mailbox half swallowed by weeds, its flag broken, the numbers long since rusted away. Beyond it, a narrow gravel path led through thick trees to a small clearing. There it was. The house from the map stood in the middle of the clearing. It was old, sagging slightly to one side, but intact. White paint peeled from its siding, and the porch steps were cracked. 2 outbuildings sat off to the side. One looked like a barn, the other a shed. Jason parked and stepped out, Rusty bounding ahead. The air smelled like pine and something else, something old. Jason walked slowly toward the porch, the key heavy in his pocket. When he reached the door, he hesitated, then slid the key into the lock. It turned with a loud click. Inside, the air was musty but dry. Dust coated the floor in a fine layer. There was furniture. Simple, old-fashioned, covered in white sheets. A bookshelf stood in the corner, still full. A wooden rocking chair faced a fireplace that hadn't seen flame in decades. Jason stepped inside, heart pounding. Rusty padded in behind him, sniffing. In the kitchen, everything looked frozen in time. A dish towel still hung from the stove handle. A calendar on the wall read July 1998. Jason pulled it down, flipping through the pages. Everyone was blank, except for July 12th. Someone had circled it. He moved through the house, opening doors slowly. Most of the rooms were empty. One had a twin bed and a toy chest. He opened it carefully. Inside were old dolls, a jump rope, and a faded red leash. Jason picked it up and sat on the edge of the bed, emotions swirling. This had to be Ellie's room. Her father had kept it just the way she'd left it. He stayed for hours, exploring. In the barn, he found tools, an old tractor, and a pile of wooden crates. The shed held gardening supplies and a rusted bicycle. But it was in the attic that he found the next piece of the puzzle. It was a journal, hidden under a loose floorboard. The cover was pink with peeling stickers. Inside, the first page read, "This is Ellie's secret book. If you're reading this, you better be Rusty, or you're in big trouble." Jason laughed softly, heart aching. He flipped through the pages, careful not to tear them. There were childish drawings, stories about Rusty and their adventures, notes about her dad and school. But then came one that made Jason pause. "Dad says if anything happens to leave Rusty a trail. I don't want to go away, but if I do, I hope someone finds him. I hope he finds the cabin." Jason looked up. Cabin? He searched the journal for more. Near the end, there was a rough map. Not the house. Another place, deeper in the woods. A star marked the spot, and beside it, Rusty's safe place. Jason stared at it, then looked down at Rusty, now curled at his feet. "You're leading me somewhere, aren't you?" The next morning, Jason packed a small bag and set out with Rusty. The map from the journal was vague, but he did his best to follow it, using the sun and natural landmarks. They walked for an hour, then 2, the trees growing thicker. Finally, they found it. The cabin was small, almost hidden in the woods. Its roof was covered in moss, and the door hung slightly ajar. Jason pushed it open. Inside were a few wooden crates, a cot, and a small desk. On the desk was a framed picture, Ellie and Rusty, just like in the photo from the tin box. But there was more. Tucked into the desk drawer was a letter, sealed in an envelope. To the one who finds him. Jason sat down and opened it, hands shaking. If you found Rusty, it means he made it. I don't know how, but he's special. He's been with me through everything. If he found you, then you're meant to help him. He's not just a dog, he's a part of something bigger. I don't know what, but I believe it. Don't give up. Keep looking. Trust him. Jason put the letter down, staring at the quiet little room. Rusty sat at his feet, looking up at him with those same wide, trusting eyes. And Jason knew. This was far from over. The real journey was only just beginning. Jason didn't sleep much that night. He lay on the old cot inside the forest cabin, staring at the wooden beams overhead, while Rusty slept curled up against his side. The letter sat on the desk just a few feet away, the words repeating themselves in Jason's mind over and over. He's not just a dog. He's a part of something bigger. Don't give up. Keep looking. Trust him. That last part especially, trust him, felt like a whisper in the dark. The wind outside rustled the branches, and every so often Jason thought he heard movement beyond the cabin walls. Probably just deer or raccoons, but in the silence of the woods, every creak and snap seemed loaded with meaning. He drifted off just before sunrise, and woke again 2 hours later, stiff and cold, but clear-headed. He let Rusty out to explore while he packed up their things. There was no electricity or running water in the cabin, but he felt a strange sense of calm there, like Ellie's presence lingered in the walls. Jason took another hour to search the place more thoroughly. Behind the desk, he found a loose floorboard and pried it up. Inside was a tin box, not unlike the first one he'd found beneath his car seat. But this one held something different. An old cassette tape, a folded hand-drawn map on thick paper, and a tiny leather-bound notebook. The notebook had Ellie's name on the first page, along with a date, July 14th, 1998. Jason carefully opened it and read the first few pages. Ellie had been trying to document something she called the trail. She described hidden markers in the woods, symbols carved into trees, odd lights she claimed to have seen at night, and a tunnel she found with her dad. One line stood out more than the rest. Dad says the tunnel doesn't always open, but when it does, Rusty can find it. Jason looked up from the notebook, heart racing. A tunnel? He whispered. The map she'd drawn was crude, but showed the area around the cabin. A red X marked something near the base of a rocky hill to the east. He folded the map carefully, stuffed it in his backpack, and clipped Rusty's leash. Let's go find your trail. The forest was dense in that direction, with towering trees and thick underbrush. Jason used a hiking stick he'd found in the cabin to keep his balance, and Rusty led the way with surprising determination. Every now and then, the puppy would stop and sniff a tree trunk or paw at the ground, then continue forward as if on a mission. About an hour into the hike, they found the first marker, just like in the notebook. It was a triangle carved into the bark of a tall oak, low enough for a child to have reached. Jason ran his fingers over the groove, amazed that it was still visible after all these years. They followed the map past 2 more markers and eventually reached the rocky hill. It was steeper than he expected, with jagged edges and a narrow path winding upward through boulders. Jason hoisted Rusty into a makeshift sling over his shoulder and climbed carefully. Near the top, he saw it. A narrow fissure in the rock face, hidden behind a curtain of ivy and moss. It wasn't much taller than a crawl space, but it looked like it had been used before. The ground in front of it was flattened, and the ivy had been cut away at some point in the past. Jason knelt and looked inside. The darkness was thick, like it absorbed light. He pulled out his phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam illuminated a narrow tunnel about 4 feet wide, leading straight into the hill. He hesitated. "We're really doing this," he muttered, then looked at Rusty, who barked once and wagged his tail. Jason took a breath and crawled in. The tunnel was cold and damp, with uneven walls and a ceiling low enough that Jason had to stay on hands and knees. Rusty followed close behind, snuffling and wagging his tail. The light from Jason's phone barely reached 10 feet ahead. After about 20 feet, the tunnel widened into a small chamber. Jason sat up, brushing dust from his jeans, and looked around. The walls had been carved by hand. He could see marks from tools, and someone had painted faded symbols in red and white. In the center was an old wooden crate, nailed shut. Jason pried it open with a flat rock. Inside were stacks of papers, some wrapped in plastic, others tucked into folders. There were photographs, too. Black and white images of the forest, people standing in front of the cabin, even one of a girl who must have been Ellie, holding Rusty. The papers were a mix of journals, maps, and strange diagrams. One showed a circle of trees labeled the Gate. Another showed a spiral pattern with a symbol at its center Jason didn't recognize. Among the papers was a file folder with a name printed on the tab. David Hunter. Jason opened it. Inside were handwritten notes, entries from a man clearly documenting his research. The first page read, "I began noticing the anomalies in 1993. Light where there should be none. Echoes without sound. Rusty always reacted first. Dogs know, Ellie knows. We're not alone in these woods." Jason's throat tightened. Ellie's father had been researching something strange. He flipped through more pages. References to the veil, a door between, and the signal kept appearing. One note read, "Rusty is more than a pet. He senses the shift. When he barks at nothing, it's not nothing. We need to finish the work. If I disappear, someone must carry it forward." Jason leaned back, overwhelmed. The story was no longer just about a lost puppy or a childhood memory. It was something deeper, something that stretched back decades. He gathered as much of the paperwork as he could fit into his backpack, took pictures of the painted walls, and backed out of the tunnel. The sun was beginning to lower behind the trees as he reached the clearing again. That night, back in the cabin, he spread the papers across the cot and tried to make sense of them. The drawings, the terminology, the maps. None of it made perfect sense yet, but patterns were forming. Rusty jumped up beside him and dropped something in his lap. Jason looked down. It was a leather bracelet with a tiny charm shaped like a spiral. "Where'd you get this?" he asked softly. Rusty tilted his head. Jason held the charm up to the lantern's light. The same spiral was in the notebook. On one of the diagrams. On the crate. He flipped open David Hunter's notes again. One entry read, "When the spiral appears, the gate is near." Jason whispered the words out loud. And then, just for a second, the lantern flickered, though there was no breeze. He and Rusty locked eyes. Jason exhaled slowly. "Okay," he said, voice quiet but steady. "We keep going." Over the next 3 days, Jason studied the materials. He transcribed the journal pages, took photos of everything, and began mapping out all the locations mentioned. Using GPS, he identified a cluster of areas marked with the spiral symbol, 7 in total, all within a 20-mile radius. Rusty remained his shadow, sitting beside him as he worked, occasionally sniffing the old pages like he remembered something Jason couldn't. And maybe he did. Jason visited the first 2 locations. Old hunting blinds, long abandoned. At each one, Rusty would find something: a piece of ribbon, a carved stone, a buried metal tag. Each item had the spiral. At the third site, deeper into the hills, they found a metal cylinder bolted into a tree. Inside it was a journal entry from Ellie's father. "The 7th gate is different. It only opens when the others are quiet. I don't know what's behind it, but I trust Rusty to find it." Jason now understood that what had started as a lost puppy story was revealing something far greater: a girl's bond with her dog, a father's desperate attempt to understand something impossible. And now, a man who had never even wanted a pet was at the center of it. One night, while studying the last of the papers, Jason found a note scrawled hastily in the margin of a map. "If the spiral turns inward, wait. If it turns outward, follow." Jason looked again at the charm Rusty had given him. The spiral turned outward. He stared at the map. Location number 4 was tomorrow. And something told him that everything was about to change. Jason left before sunrise. He packed water, snacks, a flashlight, the spiral charm Rusty had found, and a digital camera he'd borrowed from a co-worker. His phone's signal had been getting patchier the deeper he ventured into the woods surrounding the cabin, so he wasn't relying on it anymore. Rusty, as always, rode shotgun, head resting on the edge of the window, ears flicking with the wind. Today, they were heading to the 4th location on the spiral map, an area marked only as Weller's Hollow. The route took them north of the cabin, past a bend in the Sycamore Creek, through a dense stretch of trees that looked untouched for decades. There were no roads beyond a certain point, so after parking the Civic on the edge of a field, Jason strapped on his backpack, clipped Rusty's leash, and started walking. The trail was barely a trail. Wild overgrowth scraped his jeans, and damp leaves stuck to his boots. Branches snagged his sleeves, and once he had to stop to pull a stubborn burr from Rusty's paw. Still, the air was clean, filled with birdsong and the faint gurgle of the creek, winding somewhere to the east. About an hour into their hike, Rusty began acting strange. He stopped, ears perked, body tense. His tail went stiff, and he let out a low, cautious growl, not angry, but alert. "What is it, bud?" Jason asked, dropping into a crouch beside him. Rusty sniffed the air, took a few steps forward, then stopped again. Jason followed his gaze to a large pine tree up ahead. Something was carved into the bark. It was another spiral. Unlike the earlier ones, this one was deeper, more deliberate. Jason ran his fingers over it. Moss had started to grow into the groove, but the symbol was unmistakable. Below it, someone had scratched a short word: "Listen." Jason looked around. The forest was still. He pulled out his notebook and jotted down the tree's location, then studied the spiral on the charm again. It still pointed outward, according to the diagrams. Follow. They continued on. About 30 minutes later, they reached the edge of a dip in the forest floor, a shallow valley where the light barely reached. The trees grew taller here, thicker, their trunks close together like watchmen standing guard. Rusty stopped at the top of the slope and whined. Jason stepped down slowly, careful not to slip on the damp ground. At the bottom of the hollow was a clearing, oval-shaped, with a ring of stones in the center. The stones were dark and flat, worn smooth by weather or time. A few looked like they had been moved recently. Rusty padded over to the stones and sniffed them. Jason circled the ring, noticing faint scorch marks on the grass. Something had burned here. He knelt and inspected the largest rock. There was a symbol carved into the surface. This time, not a spiral, but a circle with 4 lines radiating out like compass points. Jason flipped through David Hunter's notes. Near the back of the folder, he found it. The same symbol. In the margin beside it, David had written, "Signal marker. Weller's Hollow. Lights at dusk." Jason looked up. It was just past noon. He decided to wait. He set up a small camp at the edge of the clearing, laid out a blanket for Rusty, and shared an apple with him. The afternoon passed slowly. Jason read more from the leather notebook Ellie had left behind, rereading her descriptions of strange dreams and glowing trees. She'd written one page in crayon. "I saw the sky and the ground. Rusty saw it too." Jason wasn't sure what that meant, but as dusk approached, a strange energy settled over the hollow. The temperature dropped a few degrees. The wind died completely. And then the lights came. At first, Jason thought it was just the sun reflecting through the branches, but it didn't move like sunlight. It shimmered, faint pulses of blue and gold light, like fireflies, but slower, smoother. They hovered over the stones in the center of the clearing, swirling in lazy patterns. Rusty stood, tail high, staring straight at them. Jason didn't breathe. The lights danced for several minutes, then began to spiral. Outward. The moment he saw it, Jason remembered the words. If the spiral turns outward, follow. Rusty barked once, then started moving. Jason scrambled to grab his pack and flashlight. He followed the puppy up the slope and deeper into the woods, watching as Rusty weaved through trees with a speed that didn't match his small size. Jason had to jog to keep up. After 15 minutes, they reached a strange formation. 2 massive boulders standing like pillars, a third flat stone forming a lintel across the top. A doorway of stone. Jason paused. This wasn't natural. Someone had built this. Rusty stood in front of it, tail wagging slowly. Jason approached, heart pounding. He stepped through the archway. Nothing happened, or so he thought. But then he turned around. The forest was different. The trees were thicker, older. The underbrush was gone, replaced by soft moss. The air smelled of flowers he didn't recognize. And the sky, it looked the same, but brighter, clearer. Rusty barked once and trotted ahead. Jason followed. They walked for about 10 minutes through the altered woods, Jason glancing around constantly. He saw shapes in the trees, patterns in the bark that looked almost like faces, stones stacked in strange configurations. At one point, they passed a tree with a ribbon tied around its trunk. Red, faded, but clearly placed by someone. Jason took pictures, careful not to touch anything. Eventually, they came upon a small hill with a single tree at its peak. Beneath the tree was a bench, and on that bench sat a metal lunchbox. Jason approached cautiously. Rusty sat beside the bench, quiet. He opened the lunchbox. Inside were photos, dozens of them. Jason flipped through them slowly. All of Ellie, Some as a child with Rusty, others as a teen. Then, shockingly, a few of her as an adult, holding what looked like a newer version of Rusty. Jason's hands trembled. The last photo was of Ellie and David, standing in front of the cabin. A date was written on the back in ballpoint pen. October 2012. Jason felt the world spin. Ellie had died in a car accident in 2004. Trish had told him that herself. So how were there photos of her 8 years later? He packed the photos carefully, heart pounding, and looked around. The forest remained silent, dreamlike. Rusty barked softly and nudged Jason's leg. They needed to go. Jason retraced their steps, passed through the stone archway again, and the moment he did, the world shifted back. The trees, the underbrush, the smells, they were normal again. He looked down at Rusty. The dog just stared up at him, panting. "What is this?" Jason whispered. "What are we finding?" That night, Jason sat in the cabin with the photos spread out across the table. The more he looked, the more questions he had. He picked up the one of Ellie as an adult and stared at it for a long time. If she had survived, why would her sister think she was dead? If she hadn't, how did this photo exist? And if that wasn't Rusty in the photo, how had the dog looked so much the same? Jason rubbed his face, exhausted. He needed answers. And something deep inside told him he wouldn't find them by asking people. The answers were in the woods, in the spiral. And with Rusty, he looked over at the dog, now snoozing peacefully on the rug by the fireplace. Jason stood and walked to the window. The moon hung low over the trees. Tomorrow, they'd head to location 5. And maybe, just maybe, find the next piece of Ellie's impossible story. Jason left the cabin just after dawn. The cold clung to his jacket, and dew soaked his boots as he and Rusty made their way back to the trailhead near Sycamore Creek. His pack was heavier than usual. Inside were the photos from the lunchbox, the spiral charm, David Hunter's notes, and a newly organized journal of everything he'd experienced so far. He didn't know what to expect anymore. The 5th location on the spiral map was further south, near a bend in the river called Milner's Fork. According to David's notes, this site was marked as the Echo Spot, and the few sentences written about it were vague at best. It only answers when asked. Do not shout. Do not whisper. Stand still. Listen. Jason didn't have a clue what that meant, but after Weller's Hollow and the impossible stone archway, he no longer dismissed anything. They drove as far as the gravel road would take them, then parked beside a half-collapsed wooden fence. Rusty hopped out eagerly, nose to the ground. Jason studied the map one more time, then started toward a path that led down a gradual slope and into the trees. The terrain was softer here, more forgiving. The forest opened up into wide glades, and the river murmured in the distance. Birds called overhead. Despite everything they'd seen in the past week, today felt oddly peaceful. About an hour in, Rusty darted ahead and stopped at a circle of stones laid out on the forest floor. Jason knelt beside them, brushing away fallen leaves. In the center was a wooden disc, partially buried in soil. He pulled it free. It was worn, with a faint carving of the spiral symbol. Another marker. Rusty barked softly and looked to the left, toward a clearing that sloped down to a patch of bare earth. Jason followed, stepping carefully over tangled roots. As he reached the edge, he stopped. The clearing was round, about 30 feet across. Nothing grew in the center. Not grass, not weeds, just bare, packed soil. It looked like a circle where a circus tent had once stood, or maybe a place someone had danced barefoot for years. The trees around it were taller than the ones elsewhere, thick and pale, their trunks curved ever so slightly inward, as if leaning to listen. Jason stepped into the circle. The moment his foot hit the center, everything changed. The birds stopped. The breeze stilled. A deep quiet settled over the clearing, heavy and complete. He looked around. Even Rusty had paused at the edge, sitting alert, watching. Jason didn't speak. He waited. And then he heard it. A voice, not a human one. Not quite. It was low, deep, like a rumble underwater, rising from the soil beneath his feet. The sound vibrated in his bones more than his ears. He couldn't make out words, but the tone was familiar, gentle, inquisitive. He cleared his throat and whispered, "Ellie?" The sound responded, not with words, but a subtle shift. The ground beneath him grew warmer. A breeze moved through the trees like a breath exhaled. Jason turned in a slow circle. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do here," he said softly. The clearing stayed quiet. Then, behind him, something new appeared. It wasn't there a moment before. A flat, circular stone, about 3 feet wide, had risen from the earth in the center of the clearing. Jason hadn't seen it rise. It was just there. Atop the stone sat a metal box. Jason approached slowly. Rusty trotted forward, but didn't cross the stone ring. The box was covered in dirt and vines. Jason brushed it off and opened the latch. Inside were 3 things: a weathered Polaroid photo, a stack of folded paper, and a small glass vial sealed with wax. He pulled out the photo first. It was Ellie again, but this time she stood beside someone else. A boy, maybe a year or 2 older, with sandy hair and a crooked smile. They were in front of the cabin. The picture was dated August 1999. On the back, written in blue marker, were the words, "We followed the echoes. The 5th gate is real." Jason unfolded the papers next. They were handwritten journal entries from Ellie, full of details about her time in the forest. She described visions, fragments of memory that didn't feel like her own, and sounds she could hear only in places like this. One passage stood out. "Sometimes I think the spiral is like a memory. It doesn't move forward or backward. It moves in. Dad says the 5th gate is the only one that answers, but it only tells you what you already know." Jason sat back, stunned. He looked around the clearing again. It didn't feel threatening. It felt old, intentional, as though someone or something had crafted this place to hold on to pieces of the past. He picked up the vial last. The glass shimmered with a soft gold glow, though no light touched it directly. Inside, something swirled, liquid maybe, but thicker, with sparkles like dust suspended in honey. Jason held it up, then slipped it carefully into his pack. They left the clearing as the light faded. Rusty led the way, silent and calm. Jason didn't speak until they were back at the car. "What are we walking into, Rusty?" he asked. The puppy didn't respond, just curled into the passenger seat and rested his head on Jason's arm. Back at the cabin that night, Jason went over the new journal entries. Each one hinted at more hidden places, deeper layers. Ellie wrote about another cabin, one even she had only visited once, with her father. She called it the Spine. It was marked on a page he hadn't seen before, along with a note. Only opens after gate 5. Need the key. Not the metal one. The real one. Jason stared at that line. Not the metal one. The real one. What did that mean? He pulled out the spiral charm and the glass vial, laying them side by side on the table. He had been thinking of keys too literally. He reread David's journal. One entry leapt off the page. The gates open with faith, not force. The real key is always what you carry into the silence. Jason exhaled. He looked around the cabin. On the shelf near the fireplace sat Rusty's red leash, the one from the toy chest in Ellie's childhood room. He walked over and picked it up. It felt heavier than he remembered. He turned it in his hands. A name was engraved on the metal clasp. Not Rusty. A different name. Benson. Jason froze. He pulled out the old Polaroid of Ellie and the boy. On the back, under the scribbled words, was a faded signature. Benson. Rusty looked up from the rug. Jason whispered, "You're not just Rusty, are you?" The dog tilted his head. Jason dug through the journal until he found the page Ellie had titled, Names. She'd written, Rusty is Benson. Benson is Rusty. He always comes back. I don't know how, but I think he remembers. Jason's breath caught. He remembered Trish telling him that Rusty had vanished during a storm in '98. Then another Rusty had appeared. And now, more than 2 decades later, here he was again. Always the same eyes, always drawn to the spiral. Jason stood and began packing. Tomorrow they would follow the path to the spine. And this time, Jason knew. He wasn't just uncovering Ellie's story. He was stepping into it. The morning light had a strange hue as it filtered through the trees. More golden than usual. Sharper somehow. Jason noticed it the second he stepped outside the cabin, his pack slung over his shoulder and Rusty trotting confidently beside him. The air felt charged, like the quiet just before a thunderstorm. Today, they would go looking for the spine. He had studied Ellie's journal half the night, trying to piece together the incomplete directions. The 6th location wasn't marked on the original spiral map like the others. Instead, it was buried in one of her later entries. Half poem, half riddle. Follow where the river hums, past the trees with iron drums. 3 stones stacked, not left or right. There you'll see the spine in sight. Jason had read it a dozen times before something clicked. There was a point on the larger regional trail map near an old civilian conservation corps bridge where the creek widened and curved southward. The area was unofficially known as the Ironwood Grove because of the old iron-runged barrels once used to store runoff during the CCC days, barrels that had been abandoned and rusted into the landscape. Jason remembered them from a hike years back. It had to be the place. He drove cautiously along the winding dirt road that connected the cabin to the trailhead, stopping only when the trees grew too close for his car to pass safely. He parked off the shoulder and checked the gear in his bag again. Maps, compass, flashlight, camera, Ellie's notes, water, a few protein bars, and of course the spiral charm and the glass vial. He also clipped the old leash labeled Benson to the outside of his pack. Rusty led the way through the woods, his small form weaving through brush and around logs with effortless focus. Jason had stopped trying to control their pace or direction completely. At this point, he trusted the dog's instincts more than his own sense of navigation. They walked along the river for nearly 2 hours, passing through patches of dense trees and sunlit clearings. The hum of the water echoed faintly through the trees. Eventually, they reached the iron drums, half buried, their rusted sides streaked with time. The grove had a haunted, forgotten feel, but Jason could hear birdsong somewhere up high, keeping the silence from becoming too heavy. He paused to consult Ellie's riddle again. 3 stones stacked, not left or right. They had passed plenty of rocks and cairns along the hike, but this clue seemed specific. Rusty sniffed around the base of one of the drums, then took off again, darting toward a small hill to the east. Jason followed. At the top of the rise was a triangular clearing with 3 stacked stones placed in the center, tall, flat, and perfectly balanced. They were too uniform to be natural. Jason knelt beside them, brushing dirt from the base. There were markings etched into the side, symbols similar to those found in the 5th gate clearing, but more complex. Spirals within spirals, intersecting lines, what looked like stars. Beyond the stacked stones, the forest shifted. The trees grew closer together, and the bark took on a darker color, almost gray. Rusty stood at the threshold of this new patch of woods, ears perked, tail alert but not tense. He looked back at Jason and waited. Jason stepped past the stones. Almost immediately, the sound changed. The birds were quieter, the river fainter. The wind moved in a different rhythm. It wasn't eerie, just different, like stepping into an old church where the air itself carried memory. They walked for another mile or so before they saw it. Tucked into the side of a steep hill was a structure, not quite a cabin, not quite a shed. It was long and narrow, made of dark wood, its walls slightly curved inward like ribs. It looked grown, not built, and Jason suddenly understood why Ellie had called it the spine. There was no door, just an open archway framed by bark-covered beams. Above it, carved into the wood, was the same spiral within a spiral symbol from earlier. Jason stepped inside. The interior was dim, lit only by the soft sunlight filtering through narrow slits between the boards. It wasn't empty. Along the walls were rows of shelves filled with objects. Rocks, old keys, feathers, candles, bits of carved wood, coins, dried flowers. Each item sat in its own small nook, as if placed deliberately, like a museum of forgotten offerings. At the far end of the structure was a raised platform. On it sat a wooden box and a piece of parchment pinned to the wall. Jason approached slowly, the floorboards creaking softly beneath his feet. He lifted the parchment. It was a message. To those who remember, you have come far, as we hoped you would. This place is memory. This place is breath. What you find here, you carry with you. What you leave behind, you offer to those who come next. The 6th gate opens only when given truth. Do not speak it, show it. Beneath the message was a small indentation in the platform, like a shallow bowl carved into the wood. Jason sat on the floor for a long time, thinking. He reread the message 3 more times. What was truth, and how could he show it? Rusty wandered the space slowly, pausing at certain shelves, sniffing but not touching anything. Jason's eyes landed on his backpack. Inside it were pieces of his journey. Ellie's journals, the vial, the charm, the red leash. He pulled them out and laid them gently into the indentation. The charm first, then the vial, then the leash. He hesitated with the journals. He'd grown attached to them. They were his only connection to Ellie. But something in him said this was right, that it was part of the process. He added them last. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, from the ceiling above, a faint light appeared, a pale shimmer like moonlight on water, dancing in the air just above the platform. It swirled, slowly descending until it touched the indentation and passed through the objects Jason had placed there. One by one, they vanished. Not with smoke or flash. They simply ceased to be. Jason's breath caught. The platform slid open. A hidden compartment revealed itself, and inside it was a single object. A book, bound in dark green leather with a spiral etched into the cover. He picked it up carefully. It was heavier than expected. He opened to the first page. The Seventh Gate. Instructions for the Return. Jason stared at the title. The Seventh Gate. It was real. The following pages were handwritten in the same style as David's journals, but filled with sketches, annotations, and margins filled by different hands. Jason recognized Ellie's writing in some places. The text spoke of convergence points, natural memory fields, resonance locations. It was like reading a scientific manual written in the language of myth. There were coordinates, diagrams, warnings. And then, near the center of the book, a photo tucked between two pages. It was a Polaroid of Jason himself, standing in the very place he was now, holding the same book. He dropped it. Rusty barked, just once, sharp. Jason picked up the photo again, studying every detail. It was dated 5 days ahead. He turned back to the book, heart pounding. The next page read, "Time is not a river. It is a breath held in memory. When the seventh gate opens, you will know. Follow the spiral. Do not fear what you find." Jason closed the book gently. He stepped outside the spine. The forest was quiet, waiting. Rusty stood beside him. Jason whispered, "We're close now, aren't we?" The dog wagged his tail slowly. Jason didn't know what the seventh gate would look like, or how it would change things. But for the first time since this began, he no longer felt like he was chasing someone else's mystery. He was part of it now, woven into the spiral. He would follow it, wherever it led. Jason spent the night in the cabin with the green leather book on the table beside him, its spiral imprint catching the glow of the lantern. He hadn't slept much, not for lack of exhaustion, but because every time he closed his eyes, images swirled behind his lids. The seventh gate. The impossible photograph of himself dated 5 days into the future. The items that vanished without a trace inside the spine. Rusty had curled up at the foot of the bed, a soft comfort against the increasingly surreal nature of their journey. It amazed Jason how calm the dog remained, no matter what they uncovered. As if Rusty had been through all of this before. And maybe, in a way, he had. At first light, Jason packed the essentials. He left behind some of the old notes and duplicate photos, freeing space for the green book and a few supplies. He added the Polaroid of himself into one of the inner journal sleeves, Still rattled by it, but unable to stop glancing at it. The instructions in the book were as poetic as they were scientific. Fragments that described alignments and energies, mentions of convergence points, and something called memory loops. He had marked a page late the previous night that mentioned the seventh gate explicitly. The final gate lies beyond perception, at the center of where paths fold. It cannot be seen from afar or heard by sound. Only when the other gates are known will the final one reveal itself. There was a sketch on the opposite page, a crude spiral drawn over a forested ridge with a star shape carved into the upper arc. That star was labeled with 2 words, Birch Hollow. Jason knew the name. It was a nature preserve on the far edge of the old county lines, technically still within the boundary of the forest region, but rarely visited. It wasn't remote, just overlooked, too dense for picnic areas and without trails wide enough for groups. He'd passed it on maps during his early research, but never had a reason to go there. Now it looked like everything was pointing that way. He left the cabin by mid-morning. Birch Hollow wasn't far, about a 2-hour hike southeast through steady terrain. Jason didn't rush. Something about the day felt different, like time had slowed down. Even the sounds of the woods were softened, gentler. They passed through stretches Jason had never seen before. Fallen logs covered in moss so thick they looked like carpet, patches of wildflowers blooming out of season, and trees with bark that shimmered faintly in the sunlight. He felt like he was walking through the edge of a dream. About halfway through the hike, Rusty stopped. His ears perked, and he stared into the trees to their right. Jason followed his gaze. Something moved in the distance. It wasn't a deer. It wasn't any animal Jason recognized. It moved too smoothly, too quietly. For a moment, Jason thought it was a person, but its shape didn't quite match. Tall, lanky, with arms that seemed just a bit too long. And then it was gone, vanishing into the underbrush without a sound. Jason stood still for a long moment, heart racing. Rusty didn't bark. He didn't growl. He simply watched, then turned back to the trail. Jason didn't ask questions. He just followed. They reached the edge of Birch Hollow just before noon. A faded wooden sign marked the boundary, barely legible beneath lichen and age. The path narrowed and dipped into a basin of trees where the light barely filtered through the canopy. Jason walked slowly now, each step deliberate. There was no sign, no monument, no glowing portal. Just trees, leaves, earth, wind. But Rusty knew where to go. The dog turned left at a fork that Jason wouldn't have noticed, ducked beneath a low-hanging branch, and padded into a shaded glade where the air grew still. Jason followed, branches brushing his shoulders, a hush falling over the forest like a held breath. And then he saw it. A spiral of stones laid into the ground. Unlike the earlier markers, this one was massive, maybe 30 feet wide. The stones were flat and uniform, sunk just below the surface as if they had always been part of the forest floor. Moss had grown between them, but the pattern remained perfectly clear. At the center stood a tall wooden post, carved with symbols. Not just spirals now, stars, circles, patterns that reminded Jason of constellations. Rusty walked the spiral slowly, staying close to the path. Jason stood outside the circle and watched, uncertain if he should follow. In the green book, one instruction had been clear. To open the seventh, you must carry no past, only present. Bring no map. Bring no plan. Bring only what remembers you. Jason unstrapped his pack. He placed it gently beside the first stone and knelt down. In his pocket, he kept the spiral charm. On his wrist, he wore his watch. That was all. He stepped onto the spiral. Each step forward felt strange, as if the earth adjusted beneath him. The sounds of the forest dimmed, the light shifted. As he walked, the air thickened, not in a stifling way, but in a way that felt full. He reached the center. The wooden post towered above him. Jason placed his hand on the symbols. A pulse. It ran from the post into his hand, through his arm, straight to his chest. A hum. A warmth. The post shimmered, just for a moment, and then the forest twisted. Jason blinked. He stood in the same glade, but it was different, brighter, quieter. Rusty stood in front of him. Beside Rusty stood a girl. She couldn't have been more than 10 or 11, with bright eyes and hair that bounced in loose waves around her shoulders. She smiled. "Hi," she said. Jason stared, breath caught. "Ellie?" The girl nodded. "But you're—" He stopped himself. She shrugged. "I'm here. That's what matters." Jason crouched slowly. Rusty sat between them, tail thumping the ground gently. "This is the 7th gate?" Ellie nodded again. "It's not a place. It's a time. Or all times. It's hard to explain." Jason laughed softly, unsure whether to cry or keep questioning. Ellie sat cross-legged on the moss. "You've done good. You listened. You followed. Most people stop after the first clue. But you kept going." Jason looked around. "What is this place?" "It's where memory waits," she said. "And sometimes it brings things back." He studied her face. She looked so real, not a dream, not a ghost. "Why me?" he asked. Ellie tilted her head. "You cared. Rusty chose you. That matters more than anything." Jason looked at the dog, who wagged his tail once, then looked up at him with eyes full of something deeper than a normal animal should carry. Jason whispered, "You've done this before." Ellie nodded. "He always finds the ones who remember." Jason sat beside her. The glade was still, peaceful. "I don't know what to do next," he admitted. "You're not supposed to yet," she said. "Some things come after the waiting." Jason reached into his pocket and pulled out the spiral charm. Ellie smiled. "You kept it." He held it out to her. She didn't take it. "It's yours now." Jason looked down at the charm. The spiral shimmered softly. Rusty stood and padded over to the wooden post. He barked once. Ellie stood too. "It's time to go back," she said. "But don't worry. You're not alone." Jason stood slowly. "Will I see you again?" She smiled. "You already are." She stepped backward into the post. The world twisted again. Jason stumbled. The spiral of stones was still beneath his feet. The forest was normal again. The post was silent. The light had returned to its usual gold. Rusty sat beside him, tail wagging. Jason dropped to his knees and hugged the dog tightly. No words. Just breath. Then he stood, picked up his pack, and began the walk back. The 7th gate had opened, and somewhere deep inside, he knew it hadn't closed. The next morning, Jason stood in the doorway of the cabin staring out at the forest with a mug of coffee cooling in his hand. The quiet felt different now. not empty. More like the woods were watching him the way he'd been watching them. He'd passed through the seventh gate, if that's truly what it was, and yet nothing in the world looked different, except it all did. The trees felt taller, the sky more vast, and Rusty, lying calmly beside the wood stove, felt even more like a companion than a pet. A guide, maybe. An anchor to something Jason had only just begun to understand. He set the mug down and picked up the green leather book. Flipping through the pages again, he noticed something new. A folded sheet tucked into a part of the spine he was certain had been empty before. The paper was thick and textured, almost like parchment. On one side was a map, not a trail or forest route, but a network. A series of interconnected spirals with lines and dots running between them. Nodes, patterns. It looked more like a star chart than anything terrestrial. And at the center of it all was a mark shaped like a compass rose, with the name Ashfall Crossing. Jason didn't recognize the name. It wasn't on any map he'd seen, and it wasn't mentioned in Ellie's journals or David's notes. But beside the map was a phrase handwritten in block letters. Some gates open forward, others open backward. Go to where the memory folds. Rusty perked up as Jason read it aloud. "Does that mean anything to you?" Jason asked. The dog wagged his tail and trotted over to the door. Jason folded the paper and slid it into his jacket pocket. He packed food, water, a notebook, and his camera, clipped the leash to his belt loop, and stepped out into the morning sun. The air had that freshly washed scent after a light rain. Pine, soil, something else he couldn't quite name. He didn't know where Ashfall Crossing was, but he had a direction. The back of the map included a crude legend with a rough orientation. Based on where the seventh gate had been, Ashfall Crossing appeared to be further west, possibly near the state border. Jason and Rusty hiked for hours, through stretches of pine, across wide, open clearings, over low creeks and steep embankments. Jason used the sun and compass to stay aligned with the direction of the central spiral in the map. Every now and then, he paused to listen, not for sounds, but for the absence of them. That strange hush that seemed to signal he was getting closer to something. Late in the afternoon, they came to a section of the forest where the ground felt different, firmer, older, like the earth here had been pressed underfoot for centuries. Jason stopped and looked around. Rusty stood at attention, nose lifted, ears forward. Then Jason saw it. A post, shorter than the one at the seventh gate, more weathered. At its base was a carved panel, covered in moss. Jason knelt to brush it away. "Ashfall Crossing," he read aloud. The clearing around them was small, surrounded by a perfect ring of young birch trees that hadn't been there the last time he passed through this area. He would have remembered. Their trunks were thin, white as bone, and they creaked faintly in the breeze. Jason turned slowly, noting the stillness. There were no gates, no spirals, just the post. But this time, there was something new. A set of footprints. They weren't his. They were small, light, barefoot, leading away from the post and into the forest. Jason didn't hesitate. He followed them. They led him deeper into a part of the woods he didn't recognize. No paths, no markings, just dense underbrush and towering trees. But the footprints remained, like they were freshly pressed into the earth, not more than an hour old. After nearly a mile, the forest opened into a narrow glen. In the center stood a house, not a cabin. A house. Small, 2 stories, with white siding and green shutters, perfectly preserved, like something out of a storybook. Jason froze. It was the house from the photo, the one where Ellie stood with David. He recognized the porch, the window boxes, even the slight sag in the roofline. Rusty let out a soft bark and trotted ahead. Jason followed, heart pounding. He stepped onto the porch. The door was cracked open. Inside, the air smelled faintly of lavender and something old, like old paper and wood smoke. The furniture was simple, but clean. A kettle sat on the stove. The clock on the wall ticked. He heard movement upstairs. Jason hesitated, then climbed the narrow staircase. Each step creaked slightly beneath his boots. At the top of the stairs was a hallway with 3 doors. One open, 2 closed. From the open one came the sound of someone moving. Jason stepped inside. A woman stood at the window, looking out into the trees. Her hair was pulled back, but even from behind, Jason recognized her. She turned. Ellie. Not a child. Not a ghost. A woman. Alive. Real. Jason's breath caught. "I wasn't sure you'd find it," she said softly. He couldn't speak. "I hoped you would," she added, "but I wasn't sure." Jason took a step forward. "How?" Ellie smiled faintly. "Ashfall Crossing folds everything. Time, memory. You've already seen how it works." Jason looked at her. Really looked. She was older than the photos. Not a teenager. A woman in her 30s. Her eyes were the same, though. Still bright. Still wide with wonder. "Where have you been?" he asked. "Here. There. Between." She walked toward him slowly. "I've been waiting. Rusty knew you'd come." Jason glanced at the dog, who now sat in the doorway, tongue out, perfectly calm. "You're real," Jason whispered. Ellie nodded. "So are you." They sat in the room for what felt like hours, talking. Ellie told him everything, or at least what she understood of it. How the gates weren't places in the normal sense. How time didn't move the way everyone thought. How her father had discovered the first crossing, and how it had cost him everything. How she'd stayed behind, waiting for someone who could finish the journey. "You didn't die," Jason said. "No, not the way people think. But your sister, Trish," she said. "She remembers what she needed to remember," Ellie said. "What the world allowed her to remember." Jason sat back, dazed. "I know it's a lot," Ellie said gently. "But it's real. And it's not over." Jason looked out the window. "What happens now?" Ellie stood. "There's more to see. Ashfall Crossing isn't just the end. It's a door. You followed the spiral. Now you have to decide if you want to step through it." Jason stood too. "I do." Ellie smiled. "Then come with me." She led him down the stairs and out the front door. The woods shimmered at the edges of his vision. And Jason knew they weren't done. Not yet. Jason followed Ellie as she led him beyond the threshold of the house and into the woods, deeper than he'd ever gone before. The forest behind them faded slowly, not with a sudden shift or jolt, but like colors being gradually painted over with something older, softer. The air turned cooler, not cold, just layered, like brushing through veils of breath and memory. Rusty trotted just ahead, his ears tuned forward, his paws never hesitating on the uneven forest floor. Ashfall Crossing lived up to its name. Leaves here were darker, tinged with gray, not in decay, but in a kind of permanent dusk. Trees twisted in slow spirals, mirroring the symbols Jason had been chasing since the beginning. And underfoot, the soil carried a fine layer of ash, as if each step stirred the remnants of forgotten time. They walked without speaking for a while, Jason taking it all in. Ellie moved with the familiarity of someone who'd walked these paths many times. Eventually, she stopped at a wide glade where stone pillars rose from the earth in irregular circles, 7 of them, uneven in height, but all etched with spirals and constellations. In the center of the circle, a small platform sat low to the ground, shaped like a flat disk of stone no larger than a dinner table. It shimmered faintly in the shaded light. Ellie turned to face him. "This is where it ends. And begins." Jason stepped forward, reverent. "What is this place?" "The source, the fold, the gate before all others," she said. "Where the spiral began, and where it always returns. It's not something to pass through, Jason. It's something to choose." He looked around the glade. "Choose what?" Ellie nodded toward the center stone. "Memory or return?" Jason waited. Ellie took a breath. "You've seen it now. What the spiral is. Not just a symbol, not just a mystery. It's a way of remembering, of connecting, of keeping the ones we've lost close. But there's a price. If you choose to keep remembering, truly remembering, you stay. You remain here, in this place, between places. You become part of the spiral." He felt the words settle around him like snowfall. "And if I return?" he asked. Ellie's smile was faint, sad, but proud. "You go back, to the world you left behind. No one will believe you, not really. But you'll carry pieces of this with you. You'll still remember. Some of it, and Rusty, he'll stay. He always does." Jason looked down at the dog. Rusty met his gaze steadily, calmly, like he already knew the decision. He crouched and rested a hand on Rusty's head. "You've done this before, haven't you?" The dog blinked slowly, like a nod. Jason looked at Ellie. "You stayed." "I had to. Someone had to remember, to keep it alive." He stood, walked to the center stone, and ran his fingers across its surface. It was warm, pulsing faintly beneath his skin, like touching the back of a living thing. His thoughts were racing. The journey, the boxes, the maps, the strange lights, the moment he found Rusty in his back seat, all of it had led here. All of it had unfolded like a spiral of its own, turning inward, drawing him to this moment. And all of it, he realized, was rooted in something so much simpler than mystery or magic. Love. A girl's love for her dog. A father's love for his daughter. A bond that had refused to vanish, even when the world said it should. He stepped away from the stone. "I can't stay." Ellie didn't flinch. She only nodded. "I have people back home who love me," he said. "A life I didn't appreciate until all this started. But now I know what it means. I know what it's worth." She walked toward him. "Then you know what to do." Jason turned to Rusty. The puppy sat perfectly still, eyes wide. Jason knelt again and pulled him close. "Thank you," he whispered, "for choosing me." Rusty leaned into him, tail wagging once. Ellie stood behind them now, light shifting around her in gentle halos. "He'll find someone new. He always does. That's how the spiral works. Memory travels through kindness, through trust, through small good things." Jason stepped into the ring of stone, closed his eyes, and exhaled. When he opened them, he was sitting in his car, engine off, parked in the lot outside the Dollar General in Boonville. His phone buzzed in the cup holder beside him. The sky was bright with late morning light, and his windshield reflected nothing but a quiet world. Rusty was gone. Jason sat there for several minutes, breathing. He didn't cry. He didn't panic. Because somehow, he knew this was exactly what was supposed to happen. The spiral had brought them to each other, and now it had turned again. He reached into the glove box without thinking. Inside was a folded photograph. A girl and a puppy, smiling, holding each other like they belonged to the same moment. He turned it over, 3 words written in pencil. "Keep remembering, Jason." Jason turned the key and started the car. The hum of the engine felt like music. He drove back toward Evansville, windows down, sunlight pouring through the trees. He didn't know what he would tell people, or if he would tell them anything at all. But he would remember. And someday, when another stray pup appeared in someone's back seat, tail wagging, eyes wide, he hoped they'd follow the trail. Because the spiral never ends. It just begins again.